51 years ago, television viewers were introduced to a monster in modern times. But luckily, they were introduced to a hero who was willing to shine the light on that monster and stop him. That hero's name was Karl Kolchak, and the TV movie that gave birth to the legend of the intrepid reporter was the Night Stalker. As we've covered here previously on JoBlo Horror, the Night Stalker became one of the biggest TV movies of all time when it was released, and with ratings and accolades like that, it wasn't hard to see that Kolchak's search for the truth, which we all know is out there, was far from over. And so it was the following year, Kolchak would return along with his long-suffering boss Vincenzo, and with them a new and terrifying specter that stalked the night. So journey with us into the underground, and we do mean underground, of Seattle, as we celebrate the 50th anniversary of the Night Strangler. But fear not, as we won't be going alone. Once again, we are joined by another famous fan of Kolchak and Company, as comic book legend Steve Niles will be there with us. The Night Strangler, unlike Stalker, was written by Richard Matheson first and then turned into a novelization by author Jeff Rice, who wrote the Kolchak papers. It would not only bring back Matheson, McGavin, and Oakland, but Dan Curtis would once again produce. Curtis would also step into the director's chair for this entry. Frequent Curtis collaborator Bob Cobert would also again create the film's score. The Night Strangler takes place in Seattle, Washington, where a rather similar string of murders of beautiful young women are happening at night. While there is a loss of blood, it's nowhere near what had happened previously in Las Vegas. But all the women are violently murdered, typically with their throats crushed. Vincenzo finds himself one evening in the local reporter watering hole, where it appears his usual is milk. Tony always did have some stress-induced indigestion, and if he had an ulcer, I'm sure he named it Carl. While trying to relax, Tony hears a rather irritating and familiar voice trying to regale a fellow customer with a story about a vampire stalking the night. Of Las Vegas. Vincenzo and Karl Kolchak are reunited once again. Vincenzo, remembering the raw deal Karl got in Las Vegas, gets him a job at the new newspaper that he's also working at. Vincenzo introduces him to the paper's owner, the very old-school Llewellyn Crossbinder, who warns Kolchak that there will be no sort of hoopla here. Seattle is respectable. Vincenzo watches, knowing this is probably not going to end very well. Karl's first assignment is the murder shown at the beginning of the film, that of a belly dancer who is found in an alley. Karl begins investigating, going to question the other dancers at Omar's tent, the club where the murder victim worked. It's there we are introduced to Charisma Beauty and her roommate, Wilma Krankheimer. It's an interesting exchange, to say the least.
Excuse me? I beg your pardon?
He then goes to Louise Harper, the last dancer to check with, and one who is very busy as a student. Louise believes that the murderer is probably long gone, but that's not actually true, as he continues killing. All the victims show the same signs of trauma, slight blood loss, and dead flesh left behind. As was the case previously, Seattle is no better when it comes to the authorities keeping the truth out of the papers and covering up things to ensure that there's not a panic, aka loss of tourism. Kolchak uses the tried and true method of bribery with the morgue workers to find out details of the crimes. Vincenzo can't believe his luck, and Karl's story doesn't hold back with the fact that the victims not only had holes in their necks, but appeared to be killed by a dead man thanks to the rotting flesh on their throats. It's like deja vu all over again. Kolchak heads to the dancers club and meets with Louise to find out if there are any weirdos or oddballs who come to watch her dance that stand out. Big shock, they are all weirdos and oddballs. While there, he sees Charisma and her roommate / bodyguard / husband, Wilma, and also discovers there's an underground city beneath Seattle. Old Seattle, which had been partially destroyed by a fire, and the city was built over it. Kolchak decides to start investigating further into the history of the area, his instincts telling him there's something more going on. This brings him into the domain of Titus Barry, a man whose life is research and history. Between the two of them, they discover a history of murders similar to the ones happening currently, starting 21 years prior in 1952, with the details being covered up by the police, just as they are with the new ones. Carl submits another piece on the murders, referencing this discovery and tying the two killers together, much to the chagrin of Tony. This story, including the description given from the 1952 murders of the killer having the appearance of a corpse. Another murder happens, this time with the killer having been seen with his victim. Kolchak gets an interview with the eyewitness, much to the annoyance of the police captain. And the description he gets is, he looked like a dead man. Tony nearly has a stroke while trying to eat his lunch as Carl pleads his case of the killer being a living corpse. Titus contacts Carl, having found some intriguing history again, this time a string of murders, the same MO in 1931. A reporter named Jimmy Stacks actually covered the story at the time and discovered the cover-up details of the crimes. Once again, some blood loss, an insanely strong murderer. Also, the crimes involved 6 total women as the victims. Titus and Carl discover, after digging through the archives, that every 21 years, the same string of murders have been occurring. The Chronicle's history only begins in 1887, but Carl's newest iteration of his story shows that from 1889, these deaths have been happening. The time frame for each spree is 18 days. Carl gleefully regales Vincenzo with the information, especially the bit about the cheekbones protruding through the murderer's face. But it's hard to argue with the paper's own history. So in a bit of excellent circumventing of the authorities, Kolchak has the witness give a description to a sketch artist, which the Chronicle publishes on the front page. And the hornet's nest is kicked. Kolchak and Louise go on a tour of the underground, with Carl bringing her along for quote-unquote reasons. It's there Carl is attacked by a vagrant who lives in the underground with various ailments. He asks him to keep an eye out for anyone suspicious. Carl and Louise leave, with Carl once again warning a lady he's interested in to stop working nights. Louise proves increasingly useful, however, introducing Carl to Professor Crabwell, a teacher at the university she's attending who knows about the history of alchemy, something that immediately interests Carl. He asks Professor Crabwell if by using the powers of alchemy that a man could remain young or extend his lifespan.
If it were possible, I'd be sitting here an 80-year-old sex pot.
Crabwell says that alchemists didn't study the art for that purpose, but then mentions the very real Viscount Saint Germain, who in legend was thought to have found a secret to eternal life and who had great strength. A magic elixir, she explains, and then Carl asks what ingredients would be in something like this.
Human blood, of course.
Kolchak goes back to Tony with this news, something that makes Vincenzo absolutely thrilled. Carl then goes to the police, telling them his theory with the typical results. Vincenzo loses his mind on Carl, who tries to get Tony to convince their boss to go to the police and get them to hunt down the killer, using Carl's theory. This turns into a shouting match of epic proportions. Titus brings Carl a clipping from a historical copy of the paper where Mark Twain discussed a conversation he had with a physician of the time who told the writer that he believed a man could extend his life and that immortality was actually something that could be achieved. The doctor's name was Richard Malcolm. Kolchak discovers a sketch of Malcolm from the article, showing he was a Union Army physician, and then heads to the clinic, which sits on the location of the doctor's hospital. Kolchak finds the portrait of the clinic's founder, Dr. Malcolm Richards, which he quickly scribbles over, adding a beard and mustache as well as a Union hat. And it's the same man. Unfortunately for Kolchak, the police are called thanks to his very public graffiti session, and he is arrested. Kolchak in irons pleads his case to his bosses and the police. Titus brings yet another piece of evidence, the fact that Dr. Richard Malcolm left New York for Seattle right after another spate of murders happened 21 years prior to their beginning in Seattle. He also discovers that Malcolm's family died during the fire that ravaged Seattle due to smoke inhalation. Kolchak's ego is in full swing here, and he's blind to the sheer hate of him that's been unleashed. But he knows he's right, and he calls out the hypocrisy of those in the room, just as he did in Las Vegas. He's told to leave the room while the so-called adults discuss things. Tony manages to keep Carl out of jail, but there's no more story, and Kolchak is assigned to a daffodil festival in Puyallup. Of course, he's not going to listen, and he and Louise head out into the night as Richard Malcolm needs another kill. Kolchak gets arrested again, and sure enough, bursting through a window, the doctor gets his 6th victim. Carl's bailed out by Tony while the police are in a frenzy over the murder, which is further proof Kolchak is right. Kolchak and Louise head down to the underground, using an entrance through the cellar of the clinic. Kolchak is determined to find the killer in his lair. Louise stays topside, and Carl journeys into the underground, discovering the murdered body of the tramp he'd paid for information before. He also finds Malcolm's home, with the mummified skeletons of his family surrounding a dinner table, as well as coming face to face with Malcolm himself. Kolchak's ego has put him in harm's way as Malcolm tosses him around and also tells him that he will not be leaving or be seen by anyone else again. But Kolchak knows how to play others' egos as well, and tells Malcolm that he wants to tell his readers about him. Malcolm, who is obviously insane and talks to his dead family as if they are talking to him, decides why not? There's time. So he decides, like every other villain that decided they knew more than everyone else, to gloat. He takes Carl on a tour of his domain, the fog-shrouded remains of a city trapped in time. He gives him the entire story of how he made the elixir that gave him his long life and the tragedy of his family's death. The same year he lost them, he realized he would have to kill in order to keep himself alive. Malcolm takes Kolchak to his lab, where he's creating the final dose for this 21-year cycle. The doctor believes he will eventually find the right mixture to permanently keep himself immortal without the murderers or loss of life. Kolchak is not as convinced and asks how many more women will have to die. Malcolm's answer is,
"What's a few lives compared to immortality, Mr. Kolchak?"
Kolchak looks disgusted and terrified in equal measure. The doctor is ready to take his required 6th dose of the elixir when Kolchak destroys the equipment creating it, and Malcolm looks on in shock, and then in absolute ferocity. He stalks towards Kolchak, who fights back as the two struggle around the lab. But just as Carl is about to breathe his last breath, Malcolm begins a horrifying metamorphosis, aging rapidly and being witnessed by the police, who were summoned by Louise, before asking Carl, why, and then jumping to his final death. Kolchak returns to the newspaper, perky and whistling, having solved the case and having a humdinger of a story. But he's soon charging into Vincenzo's office after seeing his desk packed up and demanding to know why his story isn't the one being shown along with the name of the killer. Vincenzo tells Carl that 20 copies of his front page were printed before the boss pulled it. Vincenzo actually backed Carl, but he tells him he was stupid for believing it would be any different than Vegas. Carl knows he's out of a job again, and Vincenzo is actually not happy about this. The two still wind up arguing and yelling at each other, as is the norm, actually with a bit more zeal than their normal. The film ends with Carl driving out of Seattle with fellow unemployed Vincenzo in the passenger seat. The duo is driving to New York, and then from the back seat is a disgruntled Louise, also persona non grata in Seattle, and completing a trio of refugees heading to the East Coast. The Night Strangler aired in January of 1973 on ABC. As you can see, it hit pretty much a consistent beat for beat of the Night Stalker, though Richard Malcolm was far more talkative a villain than Janusz Skorzeny. This second appearance of Carl Kolchak isn't as beloved as the first, but I still love it, and it benefits from a number of things. Firstly, it's got a packed number of iconic actors within the film. John Carradine, a horror legend, plays Crossbinder, the boss of Carl and Tony's newspaper, The Chronicle. Margaret Hamilton, the Wicked Witch herself, is Professor Crabwell, the university teacher who gives Carl the recipe for the immortality potion. Al Lewis, Grandpa Munster, another vampire along with Carradine, who played Dracula a few times, plays the ill-fated tramp that Louise and Carl run into in the underground. Then there's Richard Anderson, who isn't on screen for very much of the movie, but is fantastic here as a bad guy. While many kids my age will always think of him as Oscar Goldman, here he shows a great dark side. It's also interesting to note that he and Darren McGavin both played the bosses of the $6 Million Man, with McGavin being the first one. The Night Strangler is interesting to me because Curtis and Madison created a new villain in Malcolm by, at least to me, combining 3 other Gothic lit classics. Those 3 are Dorian Gray, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and the Phantom of the Opera. And of course, Jack the Ripper, who would be the focus of the first episode of the Night Stalker series the following year. Dan Curtis loved bringing classic Gothic literature to life in modern settings, and he'd go back to the plots and storylines of those classic novels like Dracula, Frankenstein, and Dorian Gray, often in Dark Shadows. Where Barnabas Collins and Janis Skorzeny would bring the vampires like Dracula into focus, Richard Malcolm would follow the Quentin Collins path. Malcolm and Quentin both were cursed with immortality. There's also the use of a haunting tune playing in their respective lairs, and a portrait of the character hanging in the cobwebbed hidden lair. Both Quentin and Malcolm also have skeletons hidden away, along with their secrets. Curtis and Madison use these tropes and create a new take on these stories with their villain in the Night Strangler. There's also the creepy Seattle underground. Here it's interesting to think of the fact that the entire underground that Malcolm sees as his home is really, in every way, a giant tomb. His dead family is there, it's buried under the streets, and Malcolm is actually dead and just doesn't realize it yet, if you want to get technical. I hate to break it to you, but the Seattle underground, while very much real, isn't at all like the massive and cool locations you see in the film. The Night Strangler was filmed for the most part in California. It was shot in a super fast 12 days too. But it actually did pay tribute to Seattle, filming a few shots actually in the city, including the Blue Banjo nightclub where the tour begins in the film. There was a planned 3rd Kolchak film that was supposed to follow this called The Night Killers, which involved aliens and would have moved the duo of Tony and Carl to Hawaii. But the series happened instead and would actually involve aliens in episode 3, entitled They Have Been, They Are, They Will Be. The Night Strangler, like the Night Stalker, and future episodes of the series all had that tiny bit of sleazy to them. I can't help but love that aspect when it comes to Carl and his exploits. The hilarious interactions between Wilma and Carl, and the way she just intimidates and glares at him, is fantastic. The very obvious relationship between her and Charisma Beauty, and Carl's obvious amusement and bemusement, is great. I also really love the chemistry between McGavin and Joanne Flug as Louise Harper. I would have loved to have seen her show up in the series at some point, trying to complete her degree and having to pay the rent by being Vincenzo's secretary to keep her involved. She really was a great foil for Kolchak and kept up with him very well. The Night Strangler showed Carl a bit at the end of his rope, and even more erratic than we'd ever see him before or after it. Vegas really broke him, and here he's just trying to regain that glory he used to have before getting kicked in the teeth. And that ego is the Jekyll and Hyde of Kolchak here, and also a nice mirror for the ego of Malcolm, his villain. I think his confrontation with the big bad wakes him up to that, but it still is a bit heartbreaking to see him once again have the truth he shined a light on be buried as deep as Malcolm's lair. While many fans of Kolchak's adventures see the Night Strangler as the lesser of the 2 films, I still really love it, and I really love Carl, and I'm not the only one. Like I said, we're delving into the dark streets of underground Seattle with a man who knows a thing or two about the darkness. Steve Niles is a legend in the world of comics. He's penned some of the greatest modern horror comics of the last few decades, with 30 Days of Night, Criminal Macabre, and even adapted the Night Strangler's writer Richard Matheson's classic I Am Legend into an awesome graphic novel. What I'm saying is, he's a good candidate to talk to about a film like The Night Strangler and Carl Kolchak, who inspired a healthy bit of his work. Hey everybody, I want to welcome as our special guest for this retrospective of The Night Strangler, a legend in the world of horror comics and comics in general, the one and only Steve Niles. Thank you, Steve, for joining us today to talk about this awesome TV movie.
Oh, thanks so much for having me. It's a pleasure.
No worries. We're glad to have you. And it's fitting as we had your co-author for Criminal Macabre meets Count Crowley on our first episode or first entry into the Kolchak universe, Mr. David Dastmalchian. So I'm going to ask you what I asked him, which was, what was your first experience with Kolchak and what influence did it have on you? Because I seem to think with me, it put that seed of wanting to be a writer in my head at one point of monster things.
Yeah, I think I guess 10 or 11 when it came out. That's Stalker. See, I saw Night Stalker first. And you know what it really introduced me to, actually, that was my first Monster Hunter, that I had ever experienced. So it had a big influence on me when it, down the line when I was creating Cal McDonald, for Criminal Macabre. He was a huge influence, huge influence.
That's great. So, and one thing that, and you'd brought up the Night Stalker, the theme between the two of them that I, coming back and I know you just said you'd rewatched this really recently for this, was the comparison between the two shows, which have very similar in their themes of women are being murdered, there's a monster, Kolchak has to stop it, no one believes him. But also there's a level, I was so shocked by, I mean, not even this Night Stalker, it seemed like the Strangler had more of a seedy underbelly to it. That was surprising for a TV movie of the week on a ABC.
Yeah. Oh, well, they used to do all kinds of stuff back then, But yeah, I thought it had a little seedier feel to it. I definitely noticed the similarities between the two stories. I mean, they were both written by Richard Matheson, who's my favorite writer in the world.
Yeah.
But yeah, I thought this one was just a little grimmer, where Stalker had, I guess, kind of a fun element, even though it was a scary vampire. This one was, dead serious. It had this stuff with the belly dancers and stuff, the sleazy nightclub and all that. So it definitely had a little sleazier feeling to it.
Well, and the other thing was, I think this one, and I think this may have been a choice in how they filmed it, was with it being the whole Seattle underground aspect, it seemed darker and there was very few, I think I could count on one hand, daytime shots in this, where at least Night Stalker, Night Stalker, you had at least some daytime shots, like you were in Vegas, you had a pull shot, things like that. But this one seemed like, I think maybe one or two, and one of them was when he went and saw her on her boat. But that's it.
Yeah, you're right. Night Stalker had, they were discovering the bodies during the day.
Right.
The one that's thrown into that, whatever that is, that
river.
Ravine. Yeah. Yeah, you're right. This one just had a little darker themes to it, So, I wonder how much of that had to do with, because the first one was a huge success.
Right.
So I wonder if they didn't want to break the mold too much. And they sort of, because it was Matheson and Dan Curtis, doing it. So I wonder if that's what the similarities were about.
Well, and also,
although I have to say one thing.
Yeah.
Oh, I was just going to say one thing was, it had one moment in it towards the end where I was sort of like, wait, the killer just told Kolchak how to kill him.
I know.
And then a minute later,
the downfall of every villain.
Exactly what the guy said. I know. It's like one thing to reveal your plan, another thing to reveal your one vulnerability.
I know. I was watching that too, like, why are you telling him literally everything? Like, he is a reporter, yeah, but
I know. I know. He's literally like, if you destroy this glass,
this is my last one. And Kolchak's like, destroy glass. So
exactly.
Like taking notes. So Darren, I kind of want to talk about Darren McGavin, because I still feel like a lot of people don't really know him other than as, oh, it's the dad from the Christmas Story, that's a great legacy to have. But to all of us, he's always going to be Kolchak, because it just was such a great character, and he imbued so much into it. And one thing that I kind of, when I went into the Night Stalker retro, it really got me, and I kind of, and as a comic guy, I'm curious what you think, is that Kolchak really was a comic book hero. He wore the same costume. He lived in a world like that. it just seemed like he was a comic book hero without a comic book, at least then.
Well, plus the narration,
Right.
which is a very sort of a hard-boiled trope, but it's also a comic trope, to have that heavy narration over the top. They just did a 50th anniversary comic book of Kolchak. Yeah. And I got to write one of the stories from it, and it was just so fun, getting to write him, because the character is just been so important to me.
Well, and it's interesting to me, and it did have all the noir, which that was so great. But also the fact that Darren McGavin had played Mike Hammer in a series, so he brought that gravitas to it. But he also had like that just smarm. There was a sweet smarm to Kolchak.
Yeah. Yeah, well, he's kind of annoying.
Yeah, he's kind of an asshole.
Yeah, well, that's what, when they tune in, when the publisher is sitting in the bar, Vincenzo is sitting in the bar, and he hears them talking. Kolchak's in the other room just pissing people off.
As is his superpower. That's his superpower as a comic book character.
Exactly.
So the one thing that I picked up on this too, because I hadn't seen it in a little while, and I remembered certain aspects, but then really towards the end, and this is definitely the Dan Curtis coming out. This is the dark shadows coming out in it, besides the music, which was just amazing. But this seemed to be like, okay, we had a vampire. What other classic monsters can we take from? And it seems to me like they took a little bit of Dorian Gray, Jekyll and Hyde, and then even some Phantom of the Opera in there. And I was curious about your take on how this fits within like a classic Gothic.
I think you absolutely nailed it. I think all three of those, I can see those elements. I thought it was really interesting that, on the second time out, because they did a vampire the first, classic monster. But on the second one, they decided to invent a monster.
Right.
I thought that was really cool. I thought that was a really cool idea, because with Monster Hunter stories, you really need to do that, because eventually you just run out.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and it was an interesting mishmash of them. And I liked how it was a neat little thing how they did the Dorian Gray part with the sketch artist, and how that sketch was what he really was when you finally saw him. And I thought that's classy. Good job, Madison. You did that.
Yeah, that was great. That was really great.
And then there was the other part of it that I thought was really neat. And it's only mentioned very passingly, which is the Count Saint Germain thing, which is, we don't really know how old he was, and not a lot of people know that story either, unless you read a lot of Chelsea Quinn Yarborough, and you realize that's that whole series. But not a lot of people know about that story, and I thought that was a nice little drop in there.
And I read that they did touch on it in the novelization.
Yeah, they did. Yeah, he kind of doesn't. Yeah. He kind of maybe.
Yeah. Now, was the novelization done after the fact? Do you know?
So I think I'm trying to remember, because the book had been written first, and then they decided to turn it into a screenplay. So I'm thinking this, I'd have to research it up again, but it seems like this was written, this may have been written as a screenplay, I want to say, and then they did the novelization to kind of fill it out. Could be wrong. Right. I could be wrong. Yeah. But I know that Jeff Rice, he may have had a couple of them already written, and then Madison came in and took them and redid them. But yeah, in the book, he kind of smiles it off and doesn't really comment. So kind of gives he's him.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, that's great.
Which is a nice little thing. The thing that the other part of the film that stood out for me, and I was curious what you thought of, was the cast in this was like a who's who of classics. You had Carrie, you had the Wicked Witch. I mean, and then on top of everything else,
Al Lewis.
Yeah, I was gonna say Al Lewis.
Munster in the middle of it, which that was the one that startled me the most.
And Kolchak too.
Yeah. I thought that was really great. And then really, I mean, for me, even the casting of Richard Anderson, because
Yeah,
he'll always be Oscar Goldman,
exactly.
So I thought that was I love the casting in that. Just it really seemed like something more people do now,
Yeah.
with trying to put in these little Easter eggs and things like that. It was just great casting, just great fun.
Well, and I love Margaret Hamilton showing up as like the historian, and it's like,
Yeah,
oh my God, wait, how we got her and Carradine in the same thing? Holy
I
crap,
know.
that's so cool.
I know. It was so cool.
I
Yeah.
it kind of feeds back into like a few years later we'd have like the whole Carradine clan and the Fall Guy with Elvira, which was just
Oh, really? Oh, I didn't know that.
oh yeah, they had a whole Halloween episode. That was a whole thing. Um, but the other part of this that continues to this day, one of the best aspects of Kolchak is him and Vincenzo. And this
Yeah.
one, I think, cements in how much Vincenzo loves Carl and just
Yeah.
goes ahead
I
and just
agree.
is like, man, fine, you're like my rock that keeps dragging me down, but I'll stay with
Yeah.
you.
I thought that ending was really great because it turned them into buddies all of a sudden. They're both in
Right.
the same situation for the same reasons. And now they have to, I guess they said they're going to New York.
They were going to New York, but we know they all end up in Chicago, except for the girl
Exactly.
who I don't know what happened to her.
Yeah.
She just shows up in the
Yeah.
back seat. But at least this one they didn't disappear on him. His poor fiance in
Yeah,
Vegas.
exactly.
We don't know what
Yeah.
happened to her.
That's right. They chased her out of town.
Yeah, because she was an undesirable element.
Right.
But that I love the fact that Vincenzo and Carl, I mean, he even gives him a job after everything that's done, and he knew it would end this way,
Yeah.
and he sticks with him anyway, and I love that. So I mentioned that the Dark Shadows was strong in this one. You've got Bob Cobert doing the music, and Curtis just putting his Dan Curtis all over this. And the one thing that stuck out to me was like how much Quentin Collins was within the character um of the Night Strangler, like the whole paintings. You had the Victrolia playing the music, and then the dead
Yeah.
family setting
The dead family around the table. I loved it. I loved it. It was just a great, creepy scene.
yeah.
I thought that.
I completely forgot about the dead family until I watched this again, and I'm just
Me
like,
too. Yeah.
there's a kid.
I think that did. Yeah. When I was a kid, I think that hit me really hard. Of all the things in there, the dead family got me.
Well, and he's just talking to them, and it's the children too. Like there's dead kid corpses, so you kind of have to go, well, did his whole family die of typhoid? I can't remember if they even describe how it happened, but obviously if there's kids, they died young from something.
Yeah.
What happened there? So you never get to hear about that. But the other part of it that always I finally got to go to the Seattle Underground, and I found myself very disappointed that it didn't look
Oh,
like.
really? I've never seen it. So
Oh
how
yeah,
does it look compared to what you
it
showed?
it looks okay. So they actually utilized that the guy at the bar where they're starting the tour is real. That guy really existed. He started the whole thing. But then if you go through the tour, I was expecting, oh, it's going to look just like there's whole buildings and it's going to look like this. The Night Strangler wouldn't lie to me. And I'm like, oh no, it's all, it looks neat, but it's not like full on storefronts that are still existing
Right.
and things like that.
Yeah.
That's called a set, Jessica. Oh, okay.
Yeah. Yeah. I didn't know. I was watching it. I mean, I could tell one of the shots was too much, look at, but I thought I bought it. I
No,
don't
yeah, it
know
it
what it
looked
actually looks
so good. But the real one, it doesn't look like, his house and all of that, where it looks like they basically are walking around a horror hammer set. But it's actually really neat. And then there is an after dark version that you can go do that shows you like the brothels and things too, that you don't want the families to go to that one. But it's really neat, and it's real. That's the thing that was always cool about it to me when I found that out, like, oh, there really is an underground. It just doesn't look like a Victorian
Right.
street.
Yeah.
So I was
That's cool.
curious. I know you're a busy man, but I have one last question for you. And uh that was uh I recently did a comparison about write up about how the Night Stalker and the Night Strangler in the series was able at that time to utilize classic monsters in a modern setting, and it worked, and it was a viable thing. And especially with the Night Stalker and Strangler, you had monsters that were able to acclimate to a modern time and utilize them, what was happening around them, for their survival. And
Yeah.
like with the vampire, he preyed on women that no one would really miss in a town that lived at night. And then
Yeah.
this one, he built upon his own home a place for him to find his victims, and he only needed to do it every 21 years. I'm curious, as a writer and as a monster fan, about your take on seeing modernized classics like this.
Brilliant job. As you know, or maybe you don't, but I prefer my vampires scary, you know. And the both times that they did it, Night Stalker movie and in the series, when they had the female vampire, they were vicious. They were just vicious. And I thought they adapted really well to modern times, actually. I thought they did a really good job.
Yeah, and also,
Although I still think the biggest thing.
oh, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, I was going to talk about the werewolf one,
Oh yeah, yeah.
because I love the werewolf episode so much, because it's a werewolf on a cruise ship. What a great idea, and I thought it was a great update. And they didn't have to over explain it, which I really loved. They never, they just had, well, wasn't it Victor from General Hospital or
It
Young and
was.
the Restless who played the werewolf? Yeah. Yeah. And he just shows up and he's bit.
Yeah.
We don't know anything else. I think they did an excellent job of making it modern without making it silly. That was always what I loved, was that the monsters were serious. They were dead serious. I always admired that.
And in some of the episodes, they're also sympathetic. You feel bad for them, and like the somnambulist one, where he was manifesting the the killer while he was stuck in a dream world. And then you had the zombie one,
Right.
and
Yeah.
they're
The
very,
robot one.
yeah,
Remember the robot?
Mr. Ring,
Very
yeah,
sympathetic. Yeah,
yeah,
very sympathetic.
yeah. And it just was a really, even though we only got one season of it, it was a really well done show. It had great creators and writers that really brought to it, and including Darren McGavin, who brought
Yeah.
his own stuff to that.
Yeah, he really did. It's just a
So
great show. It was just
fantastic. And apparently, because we keep talking about it 50 years.
exactly. Exactly.
Yeah. Well, Steve, thank you so much. And thank you for all the monsters you've brought us, because you keep creating and making some amazingly horrifying worlds. And you
Oh,
made
thank
your
you.
vampires scary as hell. So thank you
Yeah.
for that.
Oh, sure.
And
That's the way I like them.
well, and I just want to give you a chance. What do you have upcoming that everyone can be excited for and be finding?
I'm working on a couple things that I can't talk about yet, but I do have a new series coming out from IDW that I'm doing with Damien Worm that I did Oktoberfaction with. The series is called Bryn Mawr, and
I
it
think I've seen some art
starts
for
in
that.
June.
Yeah, I think
Yeah,
I saw
yeah,
some
they've
art for
they've
that.
started promoting it. So that, and then actually, Damien and I are working on like it's like a 110-page graphic novel that's a Christmas horror story called Heartbreak Manor. So we're working on that kind of simultaneously.
Nice. Well, that's why you're so busy. And that's allowed. Thank you so
Yeah.
much, Steve. And everybody, look for Steve's work online. Find Steve on social media as well, because I know he is on Facebook. And you're also are you still on Twitter or just Insta?
I'm on Twitter a little bit, not as much as I was, and I'm on Instagram.
Perfect. Awesome. Well, thank you so much. And again, Viva le Kolchak.